Shut up and sit down.
Hello, I'm Bill Webb. Welcome to the Quarterback Room, powered by Sports One. Our guest today is widely recognized as one of the world's foremost authorities on arm mechanics, specifically for pitchers and quarterbacks, but his expertise extends into other sports where functional fitness and flexibility are important, and I would assume that means most every sport. He was a major league pitcher from 1967 to 1979. He began a successful coaching career in 1980. He's now one of the most sought-after experts on arm mechanics and sports performance. He has a PhD in psychology, works with thousands of professional and amateur athletes, and is considered the father of modern pitching mechanics. We could go on and on with his credentials and accolades, but let's introduce him. He's Dr. Tom House, and he's with us today from California. Welcome, Tom.
It's a pleasure to be here, Bill. And boy, that introduction made me sound pretty special. Awesome.
You are special, and it's a treat to have you today. There's a lot of places that we could start, but let's just sort of start with the beginning. When in your career did you figure out that you had the ability to take what you were doing in your professional life and coach it and understand the science behind it?
Well, Bill, I'm sure you're aware in sports that the gene pool isn't always created equal. And I figured out early on that my genetic, my size, and my, the arm speed and foot speed weren't top level genetically. So I had to kind of make up for it with figuring out why. And if I was going to be, marginal, I had to be consistently marginal or predictable. So I started asking why early in my career from a personal standpoint, and it kind of grew from there just as a way to keep me competitive.
Well, as we mentioned in the introduction, you're recognized for your pitching expertise, but we're here to talk about quarterbacks. So I just ask you, are the concepts you teach specific to the arm and shoulder, or do they apply to the mechanics of any muscle group in the body? Because we all know, quarterback's just not about the arm and shoulder.
Well, Bill, that's a great question. We know for a fact that you're only as efficient as your worst movement, and you're only as strong as your weakest link. So old-time scouts looked for, pitchers with big bottom halves, the Stevers and the Nolan Ryan. And we know for a fact that quarterbacks were always, they weren't the biggest on the field, but they were probably the most proportional. So the bottom line is you have to match both biomechanical efficiency and functional strength together to have a successful rotational athlete. And I need to explain rotational athlete. That's where all the common denominators are. We've kind of found that throwing a football, throwing a baseball, swinging a tennis racket, swinging a bat, swinging a golf club is really all the same basic movements, the same basic timing, and the same basic kinematic sequencing. You just tailor it to the sport with the athlete that you're working with.
Very interesting. So your approach to arm mechanics, are there things that you teach and or believe that might be different from what we would, I guess, call traditional thinking, or is it more just an expansion of what we've always known?
Well, I'm 73 years old, and the way we learned and taught when I first got into baseball, 55, 60 years ago, is not what we're doing now. And it's not because the coaches were less intelligent or less motivated, but your eyes kind of lie to you. What we see with our eyes is not necessarily what's going on when a pitcher throws a baseball, a quarterback throws a football, a golfer swings a golf club. The eyes can see about 40 frames a second, and in all the elite movements that are required of a rotational athlete, they take place at about 1/250th of a second. So it wasn't until we started looking, with three-dimensional motion analysis at what these deliveries and swings look like that we realized that our eyes weren't quite telling us the truth. And that's when the real big gains in biomechanics started to come about.
In your practice, you work with pitchers and quarterbacks. I'm curious, are there really significant differences in the approach that you would take with a quarterback versus a pitcher?
This is actually kind of funny. As I was, banging around in the forest looking for, ways to get out of the forest, one day I had kinematic sequencing of pitchers on the left side of my desk and kinematic sequencing of quarterbacks on the right side of my desk. And I was looking at the graph, and I said, I screwed up here. I've got the same graph in both files. Well, it turned out to be, and this is one of those precipitous lucky things in life, that Drew Brees' kinematic sequence and Greg Maddox's kinematic sequence were carbon copies of each other. Two athletes that were 6 feet tall, weighed right at 200 pounds. And when we actually quantified their delivery for timing, sequencing, and mechanical variables, except for the timing into weight transfer, it was exactly the same. You could overlay all the graphs and they fit perfectly. And that got me to thinking, you know what? I bet, with the exception of having a 340-pound defensive lineman trying to tear your head off, the way a quarterback throws and the way a pitcher throws is virtually the same thing.
Does that extend to issues like overuse for a quarterback that's arm hurts because of overthrowing and a pitcher whose arm hurts because of overthrowing? I'm not particularly talking about poor mechanics here. I'm just talking about overutilization. Is the damage the same to both a quarterback's arm and a pitcher's arm?
It's pretty close, Bill, and it's funny that you would bring this up, because this is where I think sports are at a crossroad right now. I'll go a little bit broad picture, and we'll narrow it down to workloads that you just talked about. But a healthy arm is a function of mechanics, functional strength, and workloads. And you'll see it all the time in all sports now. The active rest and recovery, counting the 100 pitches. 100 pitches seems to be the benchmark for a starting pitcher. If you even look at basketball, they're giving basketball players days off so that the arm can recover. So there is a finite number of pitches in a particular day, week, season, career, and if all things were equal, the quantification of that boils down to how much each athlete, what price does he pay to deliver a 90-mile-an-hour fastball or throw a 55-yard pass. And our metrics, our quantifications, have allowed us that with this mechanical efficiency and this functional strength, this athlete could be a starting pitcher throwing 125 pitches twice a week. There are pitchers out there, I call it the Robbie Nen syndrome. I don't know if you recognize that name, but he had the perfect body for a pitcher, 6'4.5", almost 6'5", 95 to 100-mile-an-hour fastball, but he could never stay healthy when we tried to make him a starter. As soon as we put him in the bullpen, we found that he did really well with frequency and didn't do well at all with duration. And that was just the way that his body was put together. It turns out I'm getting a little long-winded here, but I'll close with this. Your best short man, your best reliever, your closer in the major league, and your best starting pitcher on a major league staff will have pretty much the same number of pitches thrown in game conditions at the end of the year. But a starting pitcher will do it over 25 or 30 starts, and your closer will do it over 75 to 90 appearances. So there's frequency guys and there's duration guys, and you back into that, and that's how you determine use for what is too much, what are too many pitches, and what are not enough. I hope that makes sense.
It does. So let me take it a little bit further. So we hear the number 100 pitches in baseball. Obviously, that pitcher is throwing bullpens during the week or flat ground, so that's not the only work his arm is getting. So let's extend that to football now, and you've got an 18-year-old quarterback out there who's training in the off season, maybe throwing every day. Is there any kind of comparable number for a quarterback on number of pitches or how much work they should be getting?
Yes, it is, Bill. And in the perfect world, we can actually test for that now. We call it capacity testing. But the only throws that actually count for a quarterback are when he is intensely throwing to a receiver. In other words, playing catch with the football and doing all the physical preparation to prepare to throw the football. That's not taking anything out of the arm. But when you add in the intensity of movement with trying to hit a target, on the move, those are the pitch counts that you apply to a football. So and those are the ones you mark up against for energy out of the arm and putting energy back into the arm with the weight training and the recovery stuff. So I hope I made that clear. It's just like the only pitches that count for a major league pitcher or a pitcher at any level would be game pitches to a hitter. The only throws that count for a quarterback are those intense throws to a receiver. Okay?
Yeah, that's very interesting. One sort of go down a rabbit hole just a second here. We see major league pitchers, college pitchers in particular, when they finish, they're in the dugout and they're wrapped in ice. Is that a good thing? Should quarterbacks be doing that, after a game, after a hard workout? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, our research shows that ice by itself, once a pitcher or a quarterback, if it's not trauma, if it's just repetitive movement, they're basically in muscle failure because of repetition. Ice by itself isn't as efficient as ice and aerobic activity. So we figured this out in the Nolan Ryan era when I was with the Texas Rangers. We found that arms were bouncing back in 48 hours rather than 72 hours if the pitchers actually did ice and aerobic activity. And the exact numbers were basically no more than 15 minutes on an elbow and no more than 20 minutes on a shoulder. But for every 1 minute of ice, you had to do 2 minutes of aerobic activity. So I don't know if you can remember the way back when, but when Nolan would finish, the day he pitched his seventh no-hitter, he actually conducted his interview post-game in front of all the media for 45 minutes. And in effect, he had ice on his elbow and his shoulder while he was actually on the stationary bike. So if you're thinking about having ice post-game for Little League to Big League, just make sure for every 1 minute of ice, 15 on the elbow, 20 on the shoulder, you do 2 minutes of aerobic activity. If you don't have a stationary bike, walk in the outfield while you're doing it. It's hard to jog with ice on your elbow or your shoulder in a wrap, but they have actually ice sleeves now. I hope that made sense. Ice and aerobics together, but not ice by itself.
You work with some awfully significant quarterbacks. How much of your time is spent specifically on those issues, or do you get into sort of overall quarterback play with these professional and college quarterbacks that you work with?
Bill, it's a combination of everything you just said. The 3DQB and the National Pitching Association, the two companies that I'm most involved with as an owner and an instructor, we are very shoulder-centric. Over the course of research, we found that when you hurt a shoulder, the athlete only comes back about 23% of the time. Like you can hurt an elbow, the Tommy John stuff. I don't ever want any athlete to hurt himself. But stable joints like elbows and knees, they come back 87+% of the time. But if you hurt a mobile joint, especially a shoulder, if you're a throwing athlete, it's really hard to return to form. So a lot of our focus is on specifically making the shoulder as durable as we possibly can through all forms of weight training, flexibility, and recovery work. But when we first started off, when the first couple of seconds of our conversation, I mentioned you're only as strong as your weakest link. We work on the total body, accelerators and decelerators, right and left, in a full range of motion for both absolute strength and functional strength. So it sounds way harder than it actually is, but we work all strength, all muscles, as much as we possibly can to support the physical act of whatever their mechanics are. And then you monitor workloads, and those three things together keep an athlete healthy and able to perform.
We talked about significant quarterbacks. It was widely reported that you worked with Joe Burrow over the last year, the LSU quarterback who had such a phenomenal year. What areas of focus would you spend with someone like a Joe Burrow or a Drew Brees or one of the significant guys? Is it all, is it all going back to addressing their weaknesses, or do they have weaknesses, or how do you approach somebody that's at that high level?
Yes, but whatever athlete comes to us, and believe it or not, we treat high school quarterbacks and pitchers just like elite professional quarterbacks and pitchers. When an athlete comes to us for mechanics, he's going to get functional strength, nutrition and sleep for recovery, and mental emotional management for basically stress and competition. If he comes for mental emotional, he's going to get the other three. In other words, the four legs of our health and performance table are mechanics, strength, nutrition and sleep for recovery, and mental emotional for stress management and competition. All four are necessary for health and performance. And you mentioned names like Joe Burrow. This was a young man that he had a lot of the pieces were already in place when he showed up. I met him and got to work a little bit with some of his mental emotional stuff and watch him throw. But the main instruction came from Adam Dato, John Beck, and Taylor Kelly, who are the quarterback instructors at 3D QB. So it sounds like I'm in front of thousands of people. I just got some great people working with me and for me, and the net result is the information and instruction that we've researched is science-based, it's measurable, it's deliverable, and it's defendable. And that's what kind of makes us a little different from most organizations.
Speaking of measurable, as an aside, one of the things that came out very recently about Joe Burrow was they measured his hand width, and it was only supposedly 9 inches or so. How do you look at that measurement, and does it have any impact on how you train a quarterback or how you work with them with the mechanics?
Well, hand size would be great, but it's a measurement for me that is not going to get in the way of this guy being a number one or a number two or whatever it is. He's going to be my starter. It's like there's one set of rules, but there's a million interpretations. And it turns out that even with small hands, Joe Burrow was one of the most accurate collegiate quarterbacks that played last year. So, small hands a problem. It didn't look like it with his results as that he put up as a college quarterback in his last year before going into pro ball. I think that the large hands thing came back to fumbling the ball and hanging onto it when you're getting tackled or swatted at. And then again, they probably the best passers in the early days all had big hands. Today, it's not a metric that would really bother me, as evidenced by how good Joe did this year. But again, it's one of the things that old school and new school are still looking at when it comes to the measurables that define an elite quarterback.
Speaking of elite quarterbacks, so many young athletes are visual learners, and if you can whip out your phone and show them an example of somebody or something, it's easier, it seems, for them to grasp it. Who is the one or two quarterbacks that are on Tom House's phone or in your video archives that you pull out to show the athletes you work with, this is the set of mechanics that you should emulate if it's at all possible? Are there people like that are your go-tos for mechanics?
Yeah, we have our, biomechanically perfect model. It's kind of a combination of a whole bunch of different types of individuals. But what we try to do, if we have I'm drawing a blank on his name, the University of Oregon quarterback, the big, tall kid. I think he's 6'7", 6'8", that's going to go pretty high in the draft. Those tall, willowy guys, when we give them a visual of what tall, willowy quarterbacks that are successful, how they throw the ball, we try to pick someone that has their same basic physiognomy. So we show them like a Matt Ryan or a Tom Brady when it's a big, tall quarterback. When it's a squatty body, then we'll show them a Drew Brees. But what it boils down to, there are specific, one set of specific metrics that you look for in an elite quarterback, but there's a multitude of applications. So kids learn by seeing, hearing, and feeling. You give them a visual. I would just as soon put, film a young quarterback, have him look at himself, and then either a stick figure or a composite of his type of body throwing a football on the elite level. And then what you and I are doing right now is probably the worst way for an athlete to learn, just listening to something. But if you hear, see, and feel, then the athlete gets exponentially better, depending on his work ethic, quicker.
We hear a lot of different things out on the field when quarterback coaches are working with quarterbacks, whether it's their high school coach or whoever it is. There are things like, arm angle and keep your release high and big chest and things like that. Is there anything, Tom, that's sort of commonly taught on a daily basis that's just flat out wrong or misguided?
There's a lot of stuff that coaches throw out there with good intentions that don't necessarily mean anything, and in some cases will actually be, I won't say wrong, but not quite right. It boils down to timing, sequencing, and mechanical efficiency. If you go fast, GFF, go fast forward. If you keep your eyes level and your front side firm and keep your back foot on the ground till the football leaves your hand or the baseball leaves your hand, that's pretty much the simplest way to describe throwing. So we're creatures that threw rocks at rabbits to eat. If an athlete can cut the angle, the distance, and the time, he usually has pretty good mechanics. And obviously, we talked earlier about sometimes what the eyes see isn't actually what's going on. That's where the frustration comes in. You'll hear coaches say, pull your front arm back as you throw the football. Well, we know now that you never want to give up distance, and you don't want any part of your body moving away from where you're throwing the ball. So what looks like pulling your arm back is actually your body moving toward a firm front side. Those are the small things that with movement analysis at 3 dimensions at 1,000 frames a second have kind of improved our coaching capacities.
You've been very gracious with your time, so I'll just wrap up with a couple of questions. We hear a lot about how college coaches want to see multi-sport athletes out of high school. I would assume there's good and bad to all that, and some of that involves rest, some of it involves using different muscles. Is there any science behind whether it's good or bad to be a multi-sport athlete?
That's one of the best questions I've had this year. There are windows of trainability. There's a nerve window, a muscle window, a skill acquisition window, and a skill retention window. And they're all age specific. You do not want an athlete, male or female, to specialize, especially during skill acquisition. The more nerves and muscles they can recruit, it's called neuroplasticity. The more varied the sport and the more movements they can train their body to do, the more they have up on the shelf as they get their skill for the position at the higher levels of competition figured out. If I was to throw out a number, I would not specialize in any sport until probably senior year in high school, when it becomes apparent that if you're going to get a college scholarship, you're going to play at the higher level, it's going to be at this sport. Until that time, playing all sports, making sure that more nerves can talk to more muscle, no matter what movement you're asking them to do, the better chance for long-term health and performance you're going to have.
You've been very gracious with your time, and we're fortunate to be able to share some of your work that you do on Sports One. But if a parent or athlete wants to learn more about your programs, I know you're busy, but you're also involved in a lot of different initiatives. What's the best way to benefit more in depth from the knowledge and the training you and your folks do?
Well, we have nationwide access. If someone was interested in what we actually do and where we do it, you could go to nationalpitching.com or 3dqb.com, or just Google my name or go to YouTube and pop my name, and there'll be ways to tell whoever is looking where to go in their various area codes. We've got the whole country covered with pitching, with baseball, and then by this time next year, we'll have most of the United States covered for 3DQB and quarterbacking. So again, nationalpitching.com, 3dqb.com, or just Google my name, and it will chase down where you live and how to access. And I really appreciate you bringing that up, because our number one priority is to help kids, especially the 12 and 13-year-old, get as much as they can, understand the fun of playing a sport. Because right now, worldwide, Bill, most athletes, male and female, quit by age 14. We want all athletes to play longer, which means a healthier kid, more fans for the sport. And what you're doing right now with these podcasts, and what I know that you're doing with your business is huge. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate being able to talk to you and share with you the benefit of what we've been doing for the last 50 years.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thanks very much for your time. It's been a real treat to hear your insights. Thanks for sharing with us.
Okay, Bill. Have a blessed day.